Revelation of the Daleks comes at the very apex of a crossroad in Doctor Who's history. The cancellation crisis that would result in 18 months until the next story after this one was well underway, and the show's transition from much loved and respected staple of the BBC schedules to fighting for its survival, as we all know eventually unsuccessfully, was remarkably quick and all took place while season 22 was on the air. This therefore is perhaps the last story of an era of Doctor Who that went right back to that first Dalek story. That where Doctor Who was popular and respected, and that was hard to come by in future seasons as the viewer deserted the series. But that's all a story for another day. It's just worth pointing out the circumstances in which this story was broadcast, and it'd be the Doctor's final remark that it'll take Peri to Blackpool was cut as a physical reminder of what was happening, that the previous plans for the next season with a visit to the seaside town to go up against the Celestial Toymaker again were probably going in the bin.
Alright. I'll take you to...
Yes. Psh! I always like going to psh! On holiday, always a favourite of mine. Incidentally, the original clip of Colin Baker saying Blackpool is lost, which surprised me when I heard it, because I'd somehow Mandela affected it into my head that I'd seen it in a documentary at some point. Anyway, the main thing I'll say about Revelations of the Daleks is that's actually relevant into the story, is that it's odd. Odd in a lot of ways, but it's a very atypical story, in terms of its content and focus, and in many ways its structure as well. I think it's often said, and rightly so, that this is a story focused on Davros before the Daleks, but I'd go further than that and say it's kind of focused on Davros before even the Doctor. And the litany of supporting characters, all of whom revolve around Davros, add to that as well. Now, admittedly, some of these characters are quite good, and Eric Saward, attempting to atone in his own mind for resurrection of the Daleks, does weave a good tapestry that revolves around Davros and his machinations, but it feels odd in how it's put together. Which is to be expected, to be honest, as this is a classic series' only true Davros story. In all his other appearances, he was a major component of a Dalek story. Even Genesis was about them, rather than about him at its core. But this story is a story about Davros, not the Daleks. And the Daleks therefore feel as peripheral as they ever will to a story in which they are in the name. They are very much as part of the furniture in this story, filling in the plot, and that's about it. Even when they do rise above the level of Davros' mostly mindless henchmen, it's entirely to do with Davros and to further his plot. Now, I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. On the contrary, I think it's a really unique way of looking at things, and with a few exceptions, plastic bullets being a rare good jettison of a classic series idea by RTD, the Daleks are at the most menacing they'll be at any point in the classic series post-Genesis, to be honest. But as I said, it makes for a very odd experience, and one that does sometimes work against itself, most notably in how peripheral the Doctor feels to events. The story would have played out more or less identically if he wasn't there, and it's often commented upon that it takes until we're into the second of the two double-length episodes for him and Peri to actually do anything other than slowly walk to tranquil pose and bicker a bit. This feels like a big structural failing and a sign that they probably needed a big tidy up and a rethink, keeping what works of what in there, definitely, but also addressing some of these issues and redoing it. But we'll get to all that. It would be a rather short review if that's all I said on the matter. There's one thing that does make the story rather relevant to the turbulent period in which it was made. The fact it has maybe earned itself its PG rating more than any other classic story so bestowed. Well, that's a theory anyway. I'm not sure how much we should trust the BBFC on this, given that Attack of the Cybermen, i.e. the one where a bloke gets his hands crushed until they are a bloody pulp, managed to get itself a U, while Logopolis, where the worst thing that happens is some guys with funny hair getting turned to dust off screen, somehow earned itself a 12. But semantics aside, this story is well known for being quite a bit darker than usual. There's the violence typical of this season, which we discussed with Vengeance on Davros, with Stand and Fair, like people being shot down, stabbed, having their hands blown off, but it's more often remembered for... yeesh. Now, I'm not going to suggest that Doctor Who should always be bright and campy without any kind of hard edge to it. That gets us Season 24, and Paradise Towers, and I think I've made clear my opinions on that. And I like the idea of body horror like this, and a lot of it is done very well, including this scene actually, but it's maybe a bit too far. I think the show was struggling to find a bit of an identity around this time. It had seen that the Caves of Androzani were successful and had latched onto elements of that story such as the darkness and the violence without thinking why it had worked, and unfortunately it led to it being taken too far. The hand crushing and the acid baths, of course, but also the rather shocking body horror, both in execution with the mangled remains of Stengos inside the glass Dalek you see, and in the implication rather than the explicitly shown stuff with the whole, Soylent Green thing. It's kind of insane they got away with showing this at Saturday Tea Time, if I'm honest, and, well, arguably they didn't, because this was just before the hiatus that would eventually kill Doctor Who, so as much as I think it's good for the show to try in different directions, I think maybe it was too much, and the BBC might have had a bit of a point if this was the long-term future the show was aiming for. But we'll look at all that, which I'm saying for like the fourth time, I think, so let's start looking at all that. Firstly, this story was directed by Graeme Harper, also known as the greatest director in Doctor Who's history, and Lord Harper to you, or have you know. Hot off the huge success of his debut in the series with Androzani, he was quickly brought back for a story in this season, and it's a very different kind of story for him to work on. While Androzani was a tight action piece, this story is slower, more pondering, and is comparatively light on the action. Harper obviously does an excellent job, because it's him, and I think the why is because he embraces this idea of it as a slower story, and how he portrays Tranquil Repose on the surface is quite a normal place, but with just enough eerie about it to show the problems at hand. He does a great job of making it feel a bit sickly, which I think is definitely what should have been gone for. He also does really well in making the piece intimate. Close-ups are used to great effect to show just how insidious and personal Davros' manipulations are, really focusing on those interactions to show how easy he's getting to everyone's heads. I also like how well he does with the horror scenes. I mean, yeah, it's a bit much, but it's also very well done a bit much. I love with the Arthur Stengor stuff, the intensity just builds and builds. It just becomes more and more shocking, building up to the crescendo of Natasha shooting her own father in the face. Which feels like both a better release and a horror of its own, and that's perfectly what it should be. Overall, it's a brilliantly paced and dynamic job. In fact, there's only one thing I think doesn't quite work, and that's the decision to not use any electronic modulation on the Dalek voices. I go back and forth on whether this was a good idea or not. On the one hand, the modulated voices in both Resurrection and in the next Dalek stories are not really the Dalek voices at their best, to put it mildly, but on the other hand, this does sound pretty silly at points. It's just like two blokes yelling at each other because that's what it is. It's maybe not its most inspired decision, but I think I get why. It makes it sound a bit rougher, more personal even, which I think is an interesting component to the slower, more contemplative story we have going on here, but I don't know if it was really necessary or not. I get the idea, though. Anyway, moving on from the direction, the rest of the production doesn't have too much to note. It's mostly pretty good. I like Tranquil Repose as a set design. Like all the directing, it does a good job portraying that eerie fakiness that's important to get across how sinister it really is. Although the giant statue of the Sixth Doctor does look extremely fake, you can practically hear the polystyrene. Admittedly, it's a particularly stupid part of the script, but even so. And, the soundtrack is pretty good. Most are from this era. We're still 2 years from Kef coming along and ruining everything, so... Which leads me to one last important thing about the production of the story. The Daleks themselves. The props that have been used up to Resurrection were clearly absolutely fucked, most of them dated from the 60s, and clearly hadn't even had a coat of paint, let alone any remedial work in a while. So something had to be done, and was done. A whole new set of props were built, proper ones, not just wooden ones like they did for Destiny, and they look fantastic. The white and gold is a really good colour scheme, harking back to the original silver and blue, but adding a unique new spin on it, really giving them a unique look and feeling that showed that these Daleks is a Davros creations, and visually they work in that regard. As they look more elegant, something that Davros might be more interested in the regular Daleks, to sort of massage his ego a bit. I think they look brilliant, and hell, even when the old grey ones show up later at the end, they've clearly had a coat of paint and a bit of a spruce up, so they look less tired than they did there. The Daleks themselves might be a bit peripheral, but it's been a long time since they've looked this good, so kudos to the production team there. Anyway, let's look at the script. As I said with Resurrection, I think Eric Saward is a bit of an unfairly maligned figure in a lot of ways, mostly because John Nathan Turner spent the entire Wilderness years slagging him off, and he was seen far more positively then than he was now, before we all realised he was an incompetent buffoon at best, and as I say at worst, it's best not to think about it. As for Saward, he's not a bad writer. I actually think he's quite a good one, as I think the story will demonstrate in a lot of ways. It does come together overall very well. What I think he lacks is that instinctive knowledge of what Doctor Who is and how to make it work. I've said it many times, what makes Robert Holmes the greatest writer was that he just got the show, without having to think about it for a moment. He understood what the assignment was and how to make it work, and no other writer has even held a candle to him in that regard, frankly. Certainly not RTD or Moffat, that's for sure. And unfortunately not Eric Saward either. It of course didn't help who he was paired up with for a producer. After all, it's unlikely David Whittaker or Dennis Spooner immediately understood the show in its very early days, but Verity Lambert did from the word go, and this no doubt helped them very quickly get the hang of it. But JNT, however much he thought of himself as the show's emperor or whatever, was not particularly interested in smoothing the running of the show, more like smoothing the running of his ego, and acting on whatever mad ideas popped into his head that particular morning. And with JNT in one ear coming up with insane drivel ideas every day, and Ian Levine in the other whinging about how they were slightly contradicting a missing Troutning episode in some dialogue or whatever it was, it's maybe not hugely surprising Saward never quite developed a touch for the show like it would have been ideal for him to do so. Now I want to make it clear I'm hardly a president of his fan club or anything. I think his own ego probably made it harder to counter against JNT's madness a lot of the time. He simply wasn't able to accept sometimes you need to massage the ego of the boss even if you don't listen to any of their ideas. And most importantly, I think his treatment and assessment of Colin Baker has been very unfair. But in terms of his writing, I think he does sometimes get lumped in with some of the shittier writers of the period, which I think is definitely not fair. He's not Terence Dudley, for God's sake. This story is an interesting look there for its strengths and weaknesses. On the one hand, it's a very effective piece of most of what it wants to focus on, with clear ideas and strong use of character to drive the story. But on the other, it very clearly does not very much fit as the Doctor Who story, which gives it a very odd feeling, and unfortunately quite an odd structure that isn't always successful. As I said, it has the feeling that Mr. Saward didn't quite get the show instinctively. We'll start with the stuff I feel doesn't work, and start with the obvious one that's always pointed out by everyone. The Doctor feels pretty peripheral to events. Now, this is a major flaw of the story, and it comes reportedly pretty much entirely from Saward's dislike of the Sixth Doctor, which, as I said, I think is an entirely unfair assessment on his part. And it hurts the story a lot because it feels like the Doctor is basically just a passenger in events. And he is. He and Peri spend the whole part 1, which bear in mind is 45 minutes, walking from the TARDIS to tranquil repose, stopping only to fight a mutant and admire a polystyrene statue of the Doctor. It's maybe 10 minutes of screen time. Honestly, that maybe feels like an overestimate. The entire story happens without them in the first half, and frankly, it's not as if they're speedily inserted into the action in part 2 either. Peri gets pensioned off of the annoying DJ, while the Doctor gets immediately captured, spends most of the episode talking with Natasha and or Orsini, and then finally gets to confront Davros about 15 minutes from the end. What's more, the entire plot could take place without him. It's Orsini and the Tranquil Repose staff that eventually end up with Davros being defeated. It's pretty hard to argue the Doctor was in any way a decisive presence. And he's only there in the first place because Davros lures him there for no real reason, and he sort of bounced around the plot, being captured and escaping for no reason other than so he can pop up from time to time. Having the main character be quite so luxury to events, for lack of a better word, is a sign of a poor structure. Even if it was intentional, even if you absolutely must sideline it because you don't like Colin Baker or whatever, and that is a bad decision on its own, but if you absolutely must, it needs to be better executed than this. With a clear intent around the structure, perhaps have it be part of the theme of the story that he's around the periphery of it, but it's not that way at all. There's also Peri, and I think it's pretty obvious they'd run out of things to do with her character by this point, not that they had ever much to do there in the first place, and it shows in this story. For instance, she whacks the mutant over the head to save the Doctor, and the mutant dies. She appears at first quite horrified by this accidental murdering she just did, and then doesn't seem to be particularly bothered about it ever again. A golden opportunity for some character development that's just completely ignored because, well, they probably didn't have any real interest in doing so. It's also notable how she has about 4 lines in the whole grand finale of the story, showing how really little interest they had in involving her in events, and yeah, there isn't as much else to say about that. It's just clearly not a character they had any real desire to explore, and I think that is a shame. I can't pretend I like the character personally. I don't think they ever really knew what to do with her beyond J&T wanting an American, but I think it is a shame they got to this point where she just feels so peripheral even more than the Doctor does. Anyway, another problem is that there are some plot elements that just don't work and are just confusing and unnecessary additions. I get a feeling the mutant in part 1 was only added so the Doctor and Peri would have something to do, because it doesn't make much sense in the context of it. It doesn't really seem to be where Davros' experiments have led, and in no way contributes to any kind of overall arc or anything like that. It just feels like an excuse of a fight with a mutant, because that's what it is. Equally, the cliffhanger for part 1 is nonsense. There's this giant statue of the Doctor, the extremely unconvincing one I mentioned, which has been put up because well, the story says it's to get the Doctor's attention, which surely the fate of Arthur Stengels is the thing that got his attention. So why the statue? Oh, whatever. It's also just an absurdly weak cliffhanger, which is kind of worse from the storytelling point of view. The statue has fallen on him. He's dead. Oh, wait, no he isn't. It's just total nonsense. Say we're pulling it out of his arse because A, he needed something for the Doctor to do, and B, he needed a cliffhanger. The cliffhanger is an important moment that can be vital to keep the pacing going. And here the story just grinds to a halt so we can have the useless Woogie be crushed. Yes, I'm sure the Doctor is going to die being crushed by a statue. The show will end here and that's it. And yes, you can say that for so many cliffhangers, but say, part 3 of The Deadly Assassin where the Doctor seemingly drowned, obviously the Doctor was going to survive that too. But there was genuine tension and shock in the moment because of how it had been the climax of this episode-long battle between the Doctor and Goth, and how it fed into resulting and overall themes of the story. It wasn't tactile like this. Some of the characters are weaker. Natasha and Grigory are not particularly interesting in themselves. Natasha's only interesting moments are to do with her father, and once he's dead, her utility in the story more or less disappears. And Grigory seems to be an alcoholic, but maybe not. The story's a bit unclear on that, and frankly it feels like a bit of a bizarre addition. I don't get a sense there's actually much to these two. It's mostly pretty generic lines for pretty generic characters. There were a dime a dozen in the 80s. She's tough and motivated, he's a grumpy arse along for the ride, etc. and so forth. You can practically predict line by line what they're going to say. Once Natasha's dad is dead, and they're only there to exposit to the Doctor and then get exterminated in an extremely bizarre scene, where a Dalek seemingly flies. Although the technology clearly wasn't quite there yet, the 3 years to remembrance was probably needed for it to work on screen, and then sort of explodes. I don't know what Saward was thinking with this, because what's happening is so absurdly unclear. Harper does his best, and making it feel so odd and otherworldly was probably the best course of action, but it's still a bit... eh? Oh, and then there's the DJ, played by Alexei Sale. Sale was already fairly well known at this point for being in The Young One, so obviously... And obviously is now a respected comedian, and one suspects JNT thought having him come in and play a DJ was a stroke of genius, which, in common with JNT's usual stroke of genius, wasn't one. I will say that Sale is not the problem here. He's fine. In fact, the only bit of this character I do like is when he mutters in the side about how one of the diseases being suffered from has already been cured. He carried that by making the shift believable. The problem is that the character was written to be insanely annoying. An insufferable turd who has used stupid voices and annoying noises to try and provide entertainment. And failed. Now, I don't doubt that he's meant to be annoying, but it doesn't change the fact. He's annoying. If you punch me in the face and say, oh, well, I meant to punch you in the face, I'm still going to be cross you punch me in the face. And the tonal shift, well, again, I get it's intentional to show that this is facade being played over the sinister going on at TR, but it's still a big tonal shift and he's still annoying, so what do you want me to say about it? So basically, he's a stupid one-note joke character, being annoying and adding in not funny and unnecessary humour. Why, it's as if New Who came 20 years early. Anyway, finally, I think my biggest actual issue with the story is it just doesn't feel like it has an overall point or theme to it. On its own, the involved storylines are mostly pretty good, as we'll surely get to, but I'm just not sure what this one is supposed to be about. Maybe it's supposed to be about Davros, but while so much of his stuff is effective, it doesn't feel like it dominates proceedings. It's simply one plot amongst many, and I think that lack of a decisive focus is the killer here. I wouldn't mind as much as this was the Davros show for a story, but it's not. Or if it is, then it's also the Orsini show and the Tranquil Repose show, the stupid fucking DJ show even. It just doesn't feel like it's entirely thorough in bringing everything together, and therefore, overall, it feels like it's maybe lacking a big full stop at the end. But that is it for the negative stuff, so what about the positive stuff? Well, let's start with the most important element, that of Davros. I don't think at any point in the show's history has the character of Davros been quite so prominent as he is in this story. Even in, say, The Magician's Apprentice, he is there entirely for the Doctor's character rather than his own, which is not the case here at all. The main villain here is Davros. The focus is Davros. The Daleks themselves, despite being in the title, are merely sideshows to his story. I think it's worth stopping and thinking about the character of Davros briefly, because his perpetuation post-Genesis has overall been pretty unimpressive, and my assessment that his return in Destiny was a mistake is not one I'm particularly inclined to budge from. In Genesis, his character was intrinsically tied to that of his position as the creator of the Daleks, and so much of its strength drew from that. How Davros was shaped by his own experiences and character to create the Daleks, and then he fell victim to his own failings as a result. Without that framing, it feels redundant, and I think his appearances in both of the previous stories were lackluster as a result, minus the scenes of his interaction with the Doctor, which in both stories were highlights. He just sort of fell back on the he wants to control the universe and be the leader of the Daleks things, which, I don't know, I guess it makes sense with what we saw in Genesis, but it just feels more generic than it was there. It feels like it's missing something. Now, admittedly, this story also has that as a motivation, but here it's merely the start of his character rather than all of it. That's his ultimate aim, but there's a lot more to it. In this story, we see many signs of Davros. Obviously, his megalomania is still very much there, that boiling madness underneath the surface is obvious, and when the Doctor is around, he's very much happy to let that guard down. Whatever his manipulations, this is still clearly about his own power, his own advancement, and the Daleks are once again a tool for that, just as they were in Genesis. And these new Daleks, 100% loyal, a bit like those robots Mr. Burns used in the Simpsons episode, we get to see throughout the story how well he is able to bring the elements together towards that goal, while exercising patience and manipulation. Davros' intelligence and guile really are on show here, and I like that a lot. But we see his ego as well, how he clearly enjoys being seen as the great healer, the acclaim it has won him, and enjoys it all the more because of what utter bullshit he knows it is. We see Davros' total immorality, his utter disregard for life and how he casually throws so many people away, to the point where he's using them as food. And this really hammer homes the viewer, despite how calm he has his exterior be, he's a mad bastard. I like a bit of contrast between the slick smoothness of this great healer persona, but all the while nobody has any doubt what he truly is, at least in the audience. Obviously the characters are a bit dimmer, but never mind. It's the layers to it I like, but Davros is a truly evil person, but smart enough to cover it up, certainly enough to pull the wool over the eyes of idiots like Joe Bell. This of course comes to a head in his conversation with the Doctor, which is usually the highlight of proceedings, and this time is the same. Colin Baker relishes the opportunity in the story to flex his acting chops. While the Sixth Doctor could sometimes be bombastic, over the top even, his reactions to Davros are always restrained and subtle. This isn't the situation for him to posture at, he knows what he's dealing with, and while he does it with a smirk, that's because that's who this Doctor is. We also see the true disgust in his face when Davros' plan is revealed, and we hear his contempt for Davros and the subtleties of his voice. As with Davros, he relishes both posturing in front of the Doctor, being able to drop his facade with someone he truly knows who he is and what he's doing, It's admittedly a Bond movie explain the entire plan move, which isn't as strong as motivation for the conversation as the one in Resurrection had, but the glee with which Davros rubs all he's achieved in service of this ghastly plan really adds to the moment. It's hardly a long or huge scene, but it does give us the Doctor Davros confrontation that becomes a staple of these stories, and shows us a small but effective glimpse of both of them. Davros' most effective element in the story, though, is his manipulations. Kara, for instance, putting her in a position where she's basically doing everything he wants her to, whether she's realising it or not. Most importantly, it's of two figures in tranquil repose. His big boss figure, Jobel, a pompous idiot with an inflated opinion of himself, and Tassenbecker, a student of his. How Davros interacts with these two characters is magnificent. How he soothes Jobel's swollen ego as he's necessary to his plans, and how he tosses him aside to be killed when he's no longer necessary. But as with Tassenbecker and how he has her wrapped around his little finger, maybe not the best phrase in the circumstances, anyway, how he effortlessly manipulates her, that's where it really shines. She's attracted to Jobel for some reason, but just roll with it, is it allows Davros to manipulate her to be jealous and hateful of Jobel, effortlessly playing with her emotions. Once Jobel's usefulness is over, instead of having the Daleks just go and exterminate him, he manages to convince her that she has a place in this grand plan, and all she has to do is kill Jobel to earn it. Having built to that point where the manipulations Davros does throughout the story, where he can be certain she's conflicted enough that when Jobel inevitably acts like a pompous arsehole, her fragile emotions will explode and she'll happily do the deed. And then he'll have the Daleks go in and exterminate her. What I love is that he didn't need to do any of this. He could just have the Daleks exterminate them both along with everyone else when they were no longer needed. But he manipulated her simply because he's a sadistic bastard and no doubt enjoyed watching it all unfold. Just a few choice interactions shows us that Davros is both a genius in more ways than we thought, and a complete bastard. Brilliant. It's apparently reported that Jonathan Powell, BBC controller at the time and a major figure in the cancellation crisis, ordered that this plot be reduced as he didn't like the performance of the actress who played Tassenbecker. While I don't agree with his reasoning, her performance is fine. I think the outcome was good, as this is a short and sweet subplot that doesn't overstay its welcome. If it had more time dedicated to it, I think it may have become a bit tedious. So, obnoxious executive meddling that works out alright, apparently. I will say, though, that the centre of Davros' character here is Terry Malloy's performance, which is probably the second best Davros performance there's been in the story. He's still no patch on Michael Wisher, of course, but then few would be, and here he really is magnificent. He keeps the mad shouting down to a minimum, which is always his weakest part in the performance, and it's unfortunately all he gets in remembrance, and instead lets a subtle, soothing speech do its work. Enough so that we understand how he has done the manipulation, but also with the anger boiling just a little bit under the surface. Malloy does a fantastic job of making it feel like he's a tiny thing away from exploding, but never quite getting there. A fantastic job. Anyway, I'll briefly touch on a few other less important characters. The rest of Tranquil Repose doesn't get as much time in the limelight, and that's fine, they don't need to, but there's two characters that matter a little bit. Tarkis and Lilt, workers at Tranquil Repose. They have small but effective arcs where we see they're ruthless bastards, utterly dedicated to the place, but that does work the other way too, and that they're getting fed up at Davros' bullshit is what leads to them calling for Grey Daleks. It shows a nice two-sided approach. There's more to these people than just being heroes or villains straight out. They're motivated entirely by, well, their own self-interest rather than good or bad. Then there's Kara, played by Eleanor Bron, who played the other art gallery guest along with John Cleese in City of Death, so it's a bit odd seeing her in a straight role in the series, but there we are. She's a businesswoman in league with Davros who's selling the Soylent Green across the galaxies, and someone who is much less clever than she thinks she is. Davros has her wrapped around his stump, using her effortlessly and being one step ahead of her at every point. She's clearly lucked into a good business venture, having no guile to read anyone. For instance, she's entirely unable to see how Sonny doesn't really trust her, and is surrounded only by her vacuous yes-man secretary. It's a nice little role that Bronze takes in her stride, and shows just how easily Davros is using everyone for his own ends. Then the last character to look at is Orsini, the Grand Knight Assassin of the Order of Bollocks or whatever. Point is, he's the honourable assassin Kara hires to kill Davros for her. Orsini is a character I think that maybe Saward reckons is a bit more deep than he actually is, because the archetype of the honourable assassin who kills in the name of morals, and has a code of conduct that nevertheless does not stop him from being the most dangerous person in the room. I don't think it's as original as he thinks it is. It does feel a little too convenient, maybe. Yeah, he's that smart and honourable and all that, but nevertheless, the character does work for me. Rather well, actually, for two reasons. Firstly, despite not being original, it's quite compelling. It's a nice contrast to Davros, someone who also engages in rather questionable things, but with a clearly sincerely moral edge to it. A genuine protector of what is right, something that does contrast well with Davros' great healer title built on a bundle of lies. You get he believes all he says, that he's someone with both a heart of gold and a heart of iron, depending on the circumstances. Sacrificing himself to destroy Davros' Daleks without a second thought, while cradling the body of his squire Baldric. Bostock, I mean. Anyway, that contrast is an effective reminder of who the character is. The second reason it works is a great performance by William Gaunt, who gives Orsini all the qualities he needs. Smooth, warm, likeable, certainly knows how to turn a phrase, but with a hint of that hardness that one can never quite shake, and indeed how quickly he can turn between the two is very well done. Even when he's essentially threatening the Doctor to piss off and not get in his way or he'll regret it, he keeps the stature of a smooth gentleman, honourable to the end. So overall, despite maybe being a tad generic as a character basis, it's the details of the character and the performance that elevate him and make his character all an enjoyable highlight of the story. With characters out of the way, a few words on other things. I said what I said about the horror aspects earlier, and remarkably my mind does not change in the last 15 minutes or so since I said it, but if you just take it as it is, it's astonishingly well done. It's about as successfully horrific as Doctor Who has ever become. This is mostly present in one scene, which is the one with Arthur Stangles' death. Natasha finds her father's head in this both wonderfully and horrifyingly gruesome state inside the glass Dalek, a concept from the original Dalek story that only ever made it into the Target novelisation and not the actual story, as a fun fact. Anyway, this glass Dalek holds this living nightmare. A lump of bubbling flesh that screams the agony it's undergoing, and while I can speak, its mind is not as entirely its own. Arthur's an experiment, a horrific one, and nothing more, and both the physical, his status as the mutant, and the psychological, imagining how it must be to be in that form, is supremely effective at shocking the audience. It also builds perfectly up into Arthur alternating between shouting the words of a Dalek and screaming for his daughter to kill him. It's brutal and so very well done, it's just... Jesus, not that I want to watch at Saturday tea time. Anyhow, the story itself, aside from the Doctor's involvement, is structured and paced very well. All the events lead logically into each other, it flows very well, and this means the only disjointed feeling fits are when we cut to the Doctor and Peri. And the DJ. Fucking G, the DJ. The pacing is also very good, it doesn't feel like it's rushing, there are moments for slower things to happen, but the main plot doesn't dawdle and it brings the two together very well. This means it's a brisk, enjoyable story, and I think that was an important thing to get right with concepts and ideas so odd. The plot itself is also pretty good. The stuff with Tranquil poses I've alluded to many times. It does a great job of portraying this place as on the surface a quite noble place, but under the surface really quite horrific and terrifying. It does a great job of doing that. And I think the plot twists with it work really well. The fact that all the people there are actually just being dead and used as Daleks, but also just the political stuff behind it as well. The fact that people don't want these people coming back. So yeah, I think it's all interesting stuff. It really adds to this place being more dynamic and three-dimensional. Finally, this brings us to the Daleks themselves, and it is odd because, as I said, this just isn't really their story in any way. They have a bit of agency in it, the great Daleks at the end turning up to show that this isn't going to become business as usual. The Daleks aren't suddenly going to become Davros' henchmen and that's it, but even there, with them firmly in control, this is still a Davros story. It's still Davros leading the plot and taking centre stage. And I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, it does give the room for Davros' character to take centre stage and for its successful exploration, but on the other hand, it does feel like this is the least consequential the Daleks have ever been. They feel like a backdrop, just like a prop and nothing else, and I'm not sure how much I like that. These are, after all, the oldest monsters in the show's history, and the primary antagonists are the Doctor, and yet, with both him and them feeling peripheral, it does feel like we're being a little cheated out of what it says on the cover. As for the Daleks themselves, here they do feel a little more powerful than they did in Resurrection, or frankly indeed they would do in Remembrance, helped by some effective shot choices by Harper to emphasise their menace. That the horror stuff revolves around them also really adds an element of danger and shock to it as well. It's just... well, they couldn't bloody resist, could they? The Daleks still get embarrassingly defeated several times. The stupid bastic bullets blowing them up, aim for the eye stalk remains a hilariously effective strategy to completely neutralise them as well. And it doesn't help that the Dalek versus Dalek battle feels small and anticlimactic. I know there's only so much you can do on the budget, but basically they yell at each other and shoot each other and that's about it. From neither faction do I get the sense that this is the universe's greatest menace. I don't think it's perhaps indicative of where the Daleks had got to by this point, and why they so easily slotted into being just part of the furniture. But in so many ways, for the production team, they had become part of the furniture. That Saward felt so comfortable using them in that way, I think shows that really the allure of the creatures that was originally there was gone by now. Therefore, I think their portrayal is perhaps a symptom of the overall problem rather than something on its own. Anyway, for the story as a whole, I'd say it's pretty good. It's not perfect by any stretch as we went over, but I think what counts in its favour is it focuses on the important things. Its characters allows them to drive the story rather than Resurrection was very much driven by its need to get from one plot point to the other. And I think these interactions are very much what gives the story what it needs. It is dynamic, engaging, entertaining, definitely. It keeps my interest. But I think maybe it's a bit deeper down that it lacks a bit. The Doctor's involvement is a key sign of this. The sign of a structure that hadn't really quite been thought out, or a structure that had at least been thought out wrong. As I said, the Daleks feeling like they'd better do anything in their own story was probably a sign that the Daleks themselves just weren't being used as menacing figures anymore. It was just too easy to slip into. When Doctor Who would return 18 months later, it would be a show that had already suffered its fatal wound, and would take until the rest of the decade to bleed out. Revelation is, I think, and arguably the last stories we made under the stability and prowess Doctor Who had spent 2 decades building up. And it's a very atypical story to end that with, certainly, especially given this is the series' most prominent enemies being used as henchmen for someone else, but I think it shows what Doctor Who had been getting wrong and what had been getting right. It had been too horrific, too chaotic, not enough of an idea of what it wanted to be and how to really grasp the show and what it was about. But it was also a show that, when it was good, made excellent use of character, was never short on ideas, and managed to be an entertaining and dynamic ride. So, as one era ended and the slow decay towards the end of the classic era began, it is in so many ways a fitting story to see things out. So I gave a bit of thought as what to give this story as a final score, but ultimately I think the story shares the title of Colin Baker's best story with Vengeance on Davros. I think it's very close between them. And to show that this story is roughly on par with that one, I'll give it the same score of 7 out of 10. It's flawed, no doubt, and I think it shows the flaws of its writer quite clearly in a lot of places, but nevertheless it does very, very interesting things, and the strengths of its cause, characters, ideas, structures, is what manages to make this an enjoyable outing despite its flaws. I don't really have much else to say there, it's not perfect, not amazing even, but it's a decent story, and one that I think succeeds despite how far outside the box it goes.